Hello, fellow foodies. Welcome back to the show. This is Cassandra Quaid, your host of Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. Today on the show, we're going to take an evolutionary perspective on gastronomy. We're joined by guest Jonathan Silvertown, who is a professor of evolutionary ecology and the chair of technology enhanced science education in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Jonathan is an ecologist and evolutionary biologist with a research specialty in plant population biology. He's the author of a number of highly cited publications in the field of plant population biology and citizen science. And he also has 8 books, mainly in popular science. The book that we'll be discussing today, Dinner with Darwin, Food, Drink, and Evolution, has been translated into 9 languages. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Jonathan. It's nice to meet you.
A real pleasure.
Great. Well, why don't we just start with a little bit of background? What led you to write a book about gastronomy from this evolutionary perspective?
Well, I've always been interested in food, like so many people, everybody on this, watching this, no doubt. And I, as an evolutionary biologist, took for granted that everything we eat evolved. And one day it dawned on me that this wasn't something that most people carried around in their heads. And that actually there's a fascinating story there that was not told. And I enjoy writing popular science books that give people a new perspective on something that's familiar. So I thought this was an interesting challenge, and I set out to see what I could make of this topic. So, as you've said, I'm not an expert, or at least before I wrote this book, I wasn't an expert in this subject, but I had wide interests with lots of appropriate evolutionary background. And so that's, I think it's fair to say this is the first book that's actually taken a complete view of different aspects of food, diet, and so on from an evolutionary point of view. So it kind of, introduces a panorama of the topic.
That's great. Well, let's start back with some basics, maybe with the concept of natural selection. And how does this concept of natural selection apply to the foods that we eat?
Okay, so the first thing to say is that everything we eat has wild ancestors, all right? So the natural selection occurred in the wild state. So take wheat, for example. It has a couple of wild ancestors, bread wheat. And that the natural home of the ancestral wheats for that make our bread is in Southwest Asia, so Anatolia, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, that sort of arc called the Fertile Crescent. And that's a fairly arid area, and so these plants were adapted to growing in only part of the year. And they're annuals, okay, meaning that they complete their life cycle inside 12 months. And this is why, of course, farmers have to resow cereals every year. And ancestrally, from an evolutionary point of view, that goes back to the arid conditions in which these plants evolved, where that is a favored strategy. So that's one way, but there are just so many others. Everything has evolved. The most astounding fact about evolution is that we all have a single ancestor, ultimately. There was a single origin of life on Earth today. So we are distantly related to our food. We're not eating our relatives in any meaningful sense, but that's why we all have the same DNA code and so on. So there's an amazing story there, and in fact, the difficulty in writing a book of this sort is deciding what to leave out, really.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, going back to that example of wheat, you have a chapter in the book on bread, and what can we learn from bread, and how does that teach us about domestication of crops?
Well, okay, so the process of domestication, let me just say what that is. That's basically the process of taking a wild original and shaping it for human needs so that it can succeed for us in what you might just call an agricultural context. So this process of domestication has happened in at least 26 different parts of the world for a whole group of different crops in each area. And in many of those same places, there have also been a domestication of animals. And the one that most people will have heard about is the Fertile Crescent I already mentioned, where pigs, goats, sheep, cattle, oats, lentils, peas, wheat, barley. I mean, the staples of our diet actually all were domesticated there from wild relatives. So that the process of domestication is basically a gradual one as far as we understand it. I mean, it happened first in Southwest Asia somewhere between about 20,000 and 12,000 years ago. And the most recent archaeological evidence suggests that it was a gradual process, and that before people started, if you like, sowing crops, harvesting them, and resowing some of the seed, what they were actually doing was gathering these same plants in the wild. And what we know happens when plants begin to become domesticated is their seeds are selected to be bigger. So this is almost certainly the result of human selection. It may be inadvertent. You have a handful of seeds and you resow the biggest ones. And there are some genes for seed size. And so what you're doing is artificially selecting, in a sense, copying the process of natural selection, but giving it a hand and pushing it in the direction that you want. And so this is how wolves became dogs. This is how wild aurochs became domesticated cattle, how wild sheep became tame and domesticated, and the same applies to bread wheat and any number of other things.
Very cool. So I guess one of the challenges of research in the field of evolutionary biology is just the scale of time that you really have to think about. What can you tell us about that? Like, what are some of the sources of evidence that we have for evolution of our crops?
Evolution of our crops. So
or the crop
crops,
system.
yes, that's actually okay. So we need to kind of readjust our perspective on time. So I mean, we live 80, 90 years maybe if we're lucky. So 100 years seems quite a long time to us, right? But actually, if we're talking about the evolution of crops, we're looking at 6,000 years perhaps for maize, corn on the cob, 12,000 years for wheat and barley. So that kind of time scale. And actually, that is also not very long compared to the human evolution. So the human species, we're looking at originating somewhere around 200,000 years ago in its modern form. And so on, you can go back and back. But so there are different things that happen to our diet at different points. We can talk certainly about domestication and what happened in the last, shall we say, 12,000 years. But before that, we evolved a liking for meat because we are great apes, basically. Our nearest relatives are chimps, gorillas, and the other great apes. And largely, they're vegetarian. In the case of gorillas, they're entirely vegetarian. You can call them vegan if you wanted to use that kind of term. So there's something really interesting that happened there, and that must have happened something like 6 million years ago, maybe 6 or 7 million years ago. Highly speculative. I can talk about where the evidence comes from and so on. Then cooking. I mean, all our food is cooked, essentially. I mean, well, not quite all of it, but we can't do without it. Okay. We can discuss why in a moment, but that is a fact. And we don't know when cooking started, but it's probably a couple of million years ago, 1.8 to 2 million years ago. And now we're getting nearer the present, but you can see some really fundamental things happened long before we got to domestication. So before it made any sense to domesticate sheep, you had to develop a liking for meat, and you would have, humans would have been hunting sheep and so on. And then we come to domestication. So sorry, I've lost track of what you wanted me to say about that.
Yeah, so I guess domestication is a much more recent thing that's occurred,
Yeah.
And I guess, could you walk us through what are the strategies to domestication? It's a bit different perhaps for animals and for plants. We can start with either one, but how does that process work over time?
Okay. So, as far as we know, it was gradual and probably semi semi accidental. We can't know what people's intentions were. What we do know is that there's a thing called the domestication syndrome, and there's one for plants and there's one for animals. But what's interesting is it's in common. Most plants do one set of things as they become domesticated. Animals, despite being quite unrelated to each other, dogs, sheep, very, one's of carnivores and herbivores, quite separate mammalian lineages. But the same things happen to them during domestication. So I can come to that in a moment. But what happens in plants is a set of things. They tend to lose dormancy. So most plant seeds are dormant during a part of the year. You can water them, you give them nice conditions. If it's not the right time of year, if they're not going through the right temperature regime, this kind of thing, they won't germinate. Okay, so all that gets lost. Seed size increases hugely, 100-fold easily. The number of seeds on the stem tends to go up. And a key thing is that the seeds don't fall off the plant. So you can imagine if a farmer goes to the field to harvest the wheat and all the seeds have fallen to the ground and they're being eaten by mice, it just doesn't work. So a key thing that archaeologists look for in the archaeological record, the paleontological record for the period when plants were beginning to be domesticated, is whether at the point where the seed joins the stem, it broke cleanly, which is what happens in nature. In nature, plants have evolved to disperse their seeds. It's what seeds are for. They're for sending your offspring out into the world. So you let go of them, if you like. And there's a thing called an abscission layer, and it kind of makes the seed fall off. That doesn't happen once domestication started to kick in. And what happens is that the whole branch with the seeds on is gathered as a sheaf. You imagine the sheaves of wheat, a classic symbol of agriculture, and that's then taken to the farmyard, and then it's threshed, and the threshing removes the seeds from the plant. And so using basically looking down the microscope and telling whether something has been broken off cleanly or in like a wild plant, or it's been broken by mechanical threshing, is a very good clue as to whether this is a domesticated plant or not. And what you find is there's a gradual change over 1,000 to 2,000 years in, for example, wheat and barley, things like that. Some crops seem to have become domesticated by accident. So there's a fascinating story of rye, and rye appears to have been a weed in wheat crops that was basically took over as a crop in places where wheat didn't grow very well, and rye was a weed, and then it was gradually domesticated into a crop. Then it was, in recent times, it was introduced into California to grow for people who came from Eastern Europe, like rye bread. So people started growing rye. Farmers started growing rye for this new market in the US, I think around 1900, I guess. And then the market kind of went away, and people started saying, "Oh, I don't like rye bread anymore. Grandpa did, but I don't anymore." And the trouble was that the rye then reverted to becoming a weed. So the story of rye is it started off as a weed in wheat. It then became a crop. It was then carried to the United States, Western US. It was then no longer grown as a crop, and it reverted to being a weed. So that's what evolution can do.
That's amazing. It's amazing. Well, and when I think about other factors that we observe in domesticated crops, some of the things that immediately come to mind are also the size of our crops. So whereas the wild progenitors might be much smaller, and a great example of this would be maize and its, teosinte
Oh yeah.
and how tiny it was. Can you tell us a bit
Yes.
about that story?
Sure. So the original maize plant was a thing called teosinte, and it produced cobs. It's still around
Hmm.
in the wild. Not much of it, but in Mexico, in the highlands of Mexico, and it was about the size of your little finger. And now, of course, a corn cob is like this, and that process happened over thousands of years. And I mean, what's interesting to think about is that all this was done by farmers who knew nothing about genetics. I mean,
Hmm.
the gene was discovered about 1902, right? I mean, in the sense that we understand it. And Mendel, before that, he thought of the idea of a gene, but it was entirely conceptual. The idea that it might have a physical existence, just you know. So
Yeah.
we've only understood genetics for about 120 years in any kind of detail. But people have been breeding artificially to produce most of what we eat for, like I said, 12,000 years, at least in the case of corn, not quite so long, more like 6,000 years, and achieved extraordinary changes, extraordinary changes. And you think of to step to one side away from crops for a moment. I mean, if you think of the variety of different dogs that there are,
Hmm. Hmm.
and they're all wolves. I mean, Darwin thought that he guessed they'd evolved from wolves, but he thought that there were so many dogs varied so much from one breed to another that there must have been at least 4 or 5 different wild species from which dogs had been bred. And it turns out it almost certainly is just one.
Wow.
There may have been more than one domestication of the grey wolf, but
Hmm.
it's probably just one. So, whenever I see dogs, and I don't have a dog, but, you see a little dachshund with its tiny little legs, and you see these peking. I mean, they're like different species. If you
Yeah.
didn't know anything about their breeding biology or their history, we would say they were different species. And nobody would argue with that. Obviously they are,
Hmm.
but they ain't. So that was one of the things that inspired Darwin to come up with natural selection. He wrote a very long book about domestication. And he was interested in all kinds of things, crops, pigeons at the time in
Hmm.
Victorian England. Pigeon breeding was very popular. Gooseberries. The aim of Victorian gooseberry breeders was to produce the biggest gooseberry they could. I mean, they're scarcely worth eating, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So why
Whose
you'd even
fairy
start on this
pie, right?
project, I have
Yeah,
no
yeah.
idea. But I mean, Darwin had loads of different varieties growing in his garden, and he took part in this sort of whole thing.
Yeah. Well, here's another kind of broader question. Like, how did you get interested in evolutionary biology to pursue this as a career? We have a lot of students that follow this podcast, and I'm always interested in getting perspectives from different professors on.
Yeah, well, I guess as always, it was an inspiring set of teachers. So at school, I had an inspiring biology teacher,
Hmm.
and I remember developing by the time I was 16 a very strong sense of identity as a biologist. Like 16, I wasn't particularly knowledgeable, but it became almost a badge. I'm a biologist. There was something. It's weird, isn't it? I mean, looking
Hmm.
back on it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But ultimately, it's because there was an inspiring teacher. He was demanding. He wanted. He pushed his students. Then I went to the University of Sussex.
Hmm.
Um, Great university to be at, but a fairly random choice, really. And I mean, there are a lot of universities I could have gone to, I guess. But it doesn't so happen there was a really important figure in evolutionary biology at that time called John Maynard Smith, who was professor of biology there. He had founded the School of Biology in Sussex, which was a new university started in the 1960s. And people would come from all over the world to see him, and
Hmm.
they'd give seminars, and it was just fascinating. I mean, all sorts of, famous names in evolutionary biology of that period would just drop in to see him, and they'd chat to the students, and um, so yeah, and he was a very interesting character, and later on I went to do my PhD also at Sussex, and so I sort of had more contact with him and the evolutionary biology. So although I was an ecologist, it was very much in an evolutionary context, and I've always had that that particular perspective on what I do.
That's great. That's great. Well, as I was going through your book, some of the other interesting chapters that really caught my attention were also around topics like indulgence and desserts, and what can we learn about our desire for desserts and indulgence with those. And you mentioned one dish in particular that I'd never heard of before until this past year when I've been watching way too much Netflix and saw a British baking show, and it's all about the baked Alaska. What can you tell us about that dish and also the bigger perspective on
Well,
indulgence?
I could tell you what it is, but I've never made it. I'm not even sure I've ever eaten it either. I mean, it's an interesting piece of physics, is what it is, really, more than I mean. But I'll come to that in a moment. So, I mean, why do we like desserts? Well, it's sugar, isn't it? You know, I mean, it's no big secret. It's sugar, and we have taste receptors on our tongue for sugar. It's something that shall we say, in our history, our evolutionary history, sugar would have been very rare. I mean, you know, if you go into a forest, where will you find sugar? Well, you'll find it in bees' nests, defended by stinging bees. You'll find it in fruit. And you'll find it, I guess, in flower nectar if you can get that. But it's not very common. And of course, it's a fantastic source of energy. It's an instant energy source. So you can see why evolution will have equipped us with special sensors for that. They not only sense sugar taken as sugar, but they also sense the breakdown product of starch, which is sugar. So the enzymes in our mouth, amylase, break down starch into sugar, and that is sensed by our sensors of the tongue, and it warns the endocrine system. There's a heavy meal coming. Better turn the insulin on. Right, there's a whole sort of physiological story there. But that's why we have sugar receptors, dedicated sugar receptors, right? So we don't have, I don't know, dedicated receptors for most things, but there are 6 things that we have dedicated receptors for, you know, salt, sugar, bitter, various other things. Some of them are warning. Some of them are warning. They're saying, hey, this doesn't taste nice because it's poisonous, or it might be. Sugar, it's obviously quite the reverse. It's about, this is really good, have some more of that. So now sugar is just so available. So I'm afraid, our evolutionary history tells us we want more, which isn't very good for us. Baked Alaska. So essentially, it's a meringue with ice cream inside. And I don't ask me how to make it. Look it up on YouTube or whatever. Basically, a meringue is if you think about it, it's mostly air, right? It's air trapped inside sugar, so it's like a it's polystyrene block. It's insulating, and somehow you get the ice cream inside. Don't ask me how. I guess you pipe it in or you take too hard. I don't know. Anyway, the principle is that you've got this insulator on the outside, which is the meringue, and you've got something very cold on the inside, which is ice cream. And you can put that in the oven because the insulating bit will stop the ice cream from all melting, as long as you get the timing right. And a physicist, famous physicist called Curti, who he was interested in molecular gastronomy before it was called molecular gastronomy. He was a physicist, I think he was a nuclear physicist, Nicholas Curti. He was at the University of Oxford, and he invented the inverse of the baked Alaska, which he called the frozen Hawaii. And what he did with that was he took a frozen outside. So a baked Alaska is sort of the insulator on the outside and the cold stuff on the inside. So he just reversed it, and he took ice cream balls, sort of cut in half, hollowed it out, filled it with jam, and then fused it again and put it in a microwave. And so what microwaves do is they excite liquid water molecules. So the frozen outside doesn't melt. I mean, again, it's all about timing, but but the inside can get really hot because it's liquid jam, liquid jelly, right? So you put that on somebody's plate and better warn them actually what they're about to encounter. Inside. They think this is ice cream for dessert. Inside is sort of boiling hot sugar, but anyway, he thought that was quite funny. But so
that's great.
This is what physicists get up to in the kitchen.
We got physics, chemistry, biology, all of that's coming together in the kitchen. That's fantastic. And so where can our listeners find out more about this book and others? Where can I send them to find the book?
Okay. Well, my website is jonathansilvertown.com. Very easy to find. You Google it, of course. It's published by Chicago University Press. The paperback is out earlier this year. I think it was late last year. So, usual places. Enjoy.
That's great. Well, and I have one last question before we go. Do you have any favorite recipes that have been inspired by your research in evolution?
Well, February the 12th is Darwin's birthday. So a few years ago, we had a Darwin's birthday party, and we tried to have a few occasions a sort of birthday party in which I like to try and get people to think about the well, mainly I'm in favor of people enjoying themselves, right? So I don't think people learn well by being given lectures that are too serious and intent all the time. We have to do it sometimes. So, for example, we did, this wasn't a recipe, but, we were talking earlier about domestication of crops. And what's fascinating is that a handful of crops produced a great deal of, a handful of wild plants produced a great variety of domesticated ones. So broccoli, cauliflower, all the different kinds of cabbage, kohlrabi with that swollen stem, and Brussels sprouts. I'm not sure how common Brussels sprouts are in the States. They're
I love them.
Yeah.
They're crispy.
They're all have a common ancestor in wild cabbage, right? And what's happened is through artificial selection, in the case of the Brussels sprouts, the lateral buds on the stem have been expanded. In the case of cauliflower and broccoli, to varying extents, the flower the flower head has become expanded. And all the different things that you get out of a wild cabbage, and that's all happened in the last 2,000 years. I mean, I'm not sure how long it's taken, but certainly back 2,000 years ago, you look at Roman cookbooks and they knew 2 or 3 kinds of cabbage, and that seems to be all they knew about. So, and the original cabbage comes from the Mediterranean, almost certainly. So, that's fun. You can put all these different, go to the market, buy the different kinds of brassicas, cook them, display them as a set, and amaze your friends by the story. Really, they're all the same.
That's great. I love that idea. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming on the show. It was fun learning about this. Great.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. You can find this and all of our other episodes at our website at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also find the video version of this episode and others on the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel under the Foodie Pharmacology playlist. A big shout out of thanks to our producers from Co-Conspiracy Entertainment, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth. And thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in each week. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.